Good afternoon. Our first item of business today is a statement by Michael Russell on the impact of the proposed new EU exit deal on Scotland. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions following a statement, so I would encourage members who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak buttons. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Michael Russell.
This statement will consider the impact on Scotland of the new EU withdrawal agreement and political declaration negotiated by Boris Johnson and enshrined in the withdrawal agreement bill, whose passage at Westminster was dramatically paused by the Prime Minister just over a week ago. The Prime Minister, in true Trumpian fashion, calls this package of measures a great deal. It is nothing of the sort. No Brexit can be a good Brexit, but this is a particularly rotten Brexit. It would take Scotland out of the EU, out of the single market and out of the customs union, to the great detriment of the people of Scotland and absolutely against the will of the majority. But, Presiding Officer, this is a deal which the Conservative Party here and in Westminster wants to ram through the UK Parliament, and on which it will now apparently fight the forthcoming general election. The last EU deal considered by this Parliament was rejected by 92 votes to 29. We concluded that it would be, and I quote from the motion passed by us, damaging for Scotland and the nations and regions of the UK as a whole. Nonetheless, the Conservative members of this Parliament voted in favour of that deal. And they did so because, in their own words, they were satisfied that it preserved their precious union. Indeed, so important was that red line to the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party that in the run-up to that deal being finalised by the then Prime Minister, Ruth Davidson and David Mundell wrote to her to say, "We could not support any deal that creates a border of any kind in the Irish Sea and undermines the Union or leads to Northern Ireland having a different relationship with the EU than the rest of the UK beyond what currently exists." Of course, Ruth Davidson and David Mundell are now as much history as that deal is. But the current Tory frontbench Constitutions spokesperson, Adam Tompkins, went as ever even further. He wrote this in the Financial Times in October last year. "From a Scottish Conservative and Unionist perspective, what goes for Northern Ireland must go for Scotland also. In particular, there can be no separate Brexit deal for each of the nations that comprise the United Kingdom." And he went on to say, "No unionist could ever endorse any sort of differentiated deal." What a difference a year and a new Prime Minister makes. What a difference the very survival of the Tory party makes to its members. Because 12 months on, this deal includes the clearest possible differentiated deal for Northern Ireland, one that will put Scotland at a serious disadvantage. Presiding Officer, I understand the Brexit weariness of the people of Scotland. I feel it too. They didn't want a referendum on the EU in the first place. They voted against leaving by a large majority. But that preference has been treated with contempt by the UK Government and Parliament. And 3 years on, that contempt continues. But, and this will be bad news, there is no way that this deal gets this awful, drawn-out, debilitating process of Brexit over and done with. If this Prime Minister were to get a majority for his withdrawal bill after an election, that would not end the uncertainty. It would merely unleash fresh, ever more complex, ever more acrimonious disputes on the population. More of Boris Johnson, more of Jacob Rees-Mogg, more of Nigel Farage. What an appalling prospect. What a veritable continuous Halloween of sneering anti-democratic horror on our screens for another year or 2 or 3. For Presiding Officer, the Withdrawal Agreement Bill envisages a future relationship with the EU which will be negotiated and ratified inside barely 12 months. That beggars belief. Even if the full option of a 2-year extension to the transition period were taken up, such a 3-year period would be an exceptionally fast negotiation. By comparison, the EU-Canada agreement took 7 years to negotiate, and EU-Japan 6 years. A much more likely scenario is the UK crashing out of the transition period at the end of 2020 with no deal agreed, in order to satisfy the Brexit extremists in the Tory party. That would mean years of economic stagnation, followed inevitably at some point by the resumption of negotiations with the EU. The regrettable truth, Presiding Officer, is that the Brexit chaos will continue to dominate UK politics for years, possibly decades to come, unless Scotland decides to put paid to that by ending Brexit for good. That the only way to have done with Brexit is to have done with the very idea of leaving the EU. To do what Scotland did in June 2016 when it rejected Brexit, but to do it more forcibly within an election and with a demand for us to take the right to choose our own future into our own hands. Presiding Officer, this afternoon the Scottish Government is publishing an assessment of the impact of the latest withdrawal agreement and political declaration. That assessment concludes that what is being proposed is an even more damaging deal than the May deal this Parliament rejected last year. Let me deal with some elements of it. First, as I've said, it takes Scotland out of the single market, which is the largest and most lucrative market in the world. Membership presently provides Scotland businesses with unrestricted access to over 510 million people. Last year, around 6,900 companies operated in Scotland exported goods to the EU, and 11,000 companies here in Scotland were reliant on imports from elsewhere in the EU. The EU's four freedoms, the freedom of movement of goods, services, capital and people, have for decades brought huge advantages to Scotland and the UK, and the economic consequences of losing those advantages will be severe. In fact, the impact of a trade agreement of the type the UK government intends could lower Scottish GDP by 6.1% by 2030 compared to EU membership. That is equivalent to a cost of £1,600 for each and every person in Scotland. And just today we had further confirmation of the extraordinary cost of Brexit. A report from the highly respected National Institute of Economic and Social Research has found that this Tory deal will cost the UK £70 billion in the next 10 years. Moreover, to make things even worse, Scotland is now to be placed at a competitive disadvantage to Northern Ireland because of the special deal the Tories said must never be struck. The Scottish Government fully and unconditionally supports the Good Friday Agreement. We recognise the importance of maintaining an invisible border on the island of Ireland. We do not want to prevent Northern Ireland benefiting from this special deal, but we could never accept allowing Scottish businesses to lose market share in the single market compared with their direct competitors in Northern Ireland. And in fact, economic growth in Scotland is already being damaged. Last week, the Fraser of Allender Institute's most recent economic commentary estimated that the Scottish economy is already around 2% smaller, that's £3 billion smaller, than it would have been without the vote to leave the EU. And this deal is also a threat to many of our vital rights and protections. The purpose of level playing field provisions in free trade agreements is to protect businesses in one country from deregulation in another, which would distort the market. It's inevitable that the EU27 will require from the UK a more robust level playing field commitment than those which were acceptable for agreements with the likes of Canada and Japan. This is in the greatest part because the UK's economic scale and geographic proximity make it far more of a risk to the EU marketplace as a competitor. The May deal recognised that and agreed to the inclusion of level playing field protections within the legally binding withdrawal agreement as part of the backstop arrangements which allowed for a closer relationship. But the Johnson government has removed them from the withdrawal agreement and left only weaker references in the non-binding protocol, but it says it still respects them. That change can only mean a more distant relationship is envisaged. Could anyone be taken in by such a sleight of hand? Particularly from those who have spent their entire political careers railing against these protections. Presiding Officer, the leopard doesn't change its spots. The EU played a hugely important role over decades in driving up standards for our environmental protection and social and environmental rights. But there is no doubt that in a few short years, all that work will have been for nothing as far as ordinary people in this country are concerned. We know that the Prime Minister is desperate to do a trade deal with Donald Trump, which will open our markets to chlorine-washed chicken, hormone-injected beef, and which we saw this week will damage our NHS by allowing drug prices to be driven up to fill American billionaires' pockets. Our devolved competences will be sidelined in that process, and as a result, our citizens will have their basic rights and protections eroded year on year. That is what the Conservatives in this chamber are supporting. But there are more reasons to reject absolutely this so-called great deal. On the issue of population and migration, the deal will undermine the rights and well-being of those EU citizens who have chosen to make Scotland or the UK their home, and it will make it much more difficult to attract people from across the EU to visit, study, work and live here in the future. Let's be clear, the UK government should not be making EU citizens apply to maintain rights they already have. But whilst they are doing so, it would be wisest for EU citizens to apply for and gain settled status. However, the UK government should in return implement in UK law the commitments they have made to protect UK citizens' rights in the UK as set out in the withdrawal agreement, and to do so without reference to the rest of the deal. That would be the fair and humane thing to do. And it would say loudly and clearly, as our First Minister did again last week, we want EU citizens to continue to be valued members of our communities. There is a practical reason for doing so as well, because not doing so will discourage much-needed migration and drive people who are here away. In a scenario of 50% less EU migration, our working-age population will decline by 1.9% over the next 25 years, hitting the economy, the NHS and social care very hard, particularly in rural areas. Let me now, Presiding Officer, make a final point about democracy and the Constitution. This deal will give Northern Ireland the right to consent to any new arrangements, but deny such a right to Scotland. That is democratically wrong. Moreover, Scotland not only voted by a large majority in 2016 to remain in the European Union, but we did so by a larger majority than in Northern Ireland. That choice has been and continues to be ignored and dismissed by the UK government. In July 2016, the former Prime Minister promised she would not trigger Article 50 until she thought there was an agreed UK approach and objective for negotiations. She helped to establish a new joint ministerial committee on EU negotiations with terms of reference to seek to agree that UK approach for negotiations. But in March 2017, she sent in the letter to trigger Article 50 without any agreement by that committee. Indeed, she sent it without the committee ever seeing the letter. Of course, in January of that year, she had also dismissed our proposed compromise position as set out in the First Scotland's Place in Europe document before any discussion could even be held in the JMC. That has been the pattern for the last 3 years. Not once has the UK government sought to agree with the devolved administrations the content of the withdrawal agreement or political declaration. In fact, Presiding Officer, our views have not been sought on a single paragraph of the over 500 pages of text agreed with the EU. And this Prime Minister has been even worse than the last. He doesn't even know or care how devolution works. In fact, he doesn't even know what his own government is doing. When he was asked last week in the House of Commons if he would allow this bill to pass without consent given by the Scottish Parliament, he responded that the Scottish Parliament has no role in approving this deal. He was just wrong. He was wrong. In fact, his government had already asked for legislative consent from this Parliament. It had to do so. And if it is refused, then he will defy democracy if he uses a power only used once before in devolution and overrule us. And given the present opposition, he will have to do the same in Wales. And the majority of MPs in Wales, in Scotland, and even in Northern Ireland oppose his deal too. He has no democratic mandate to proceed here. And the fact that fact alone should, but alas won't, stay the hand of the Tories in this chamber and make them think again. The paper we have published today sets out the scale of the damage the Tories here and in Westminster want to inflict on Scotland. It demonstrates beyond doubt that the Tories here and at Westminster have nothing but contempt for the Scottish Parliament, government and people. The Tories here and at Westminster are hell-bent on imposing on Scotland a so-called deal that will leave Scotland poorer, distant from our friends in Europe, vulnerable to trade bullying from Donald Trump, with workers' rights and protections under threat, and our environment trashed. We should never accept that, and we will never accept that. Scotland is a country of enormous potential, with talent, wealth, resources, and cutting-edge industries. The people of Scotland have the right to determine our own future, free from the Brexit chaos we see at Westminster every day. A future as an independent member of the European Union. It is time, Presiding Officer, that the people of Scotland were given the chance to say so. And first of all, that will happen in an election on the 12th of December. Bring it on.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Point of order, Murdo Fraser.
I'm aware, Presiding Officer, you chair the Parliamentary Bureau. The Parliamentary Bureau sets the programme for meetings in this chamber and decides on the allocation of business. Ministerial statements are here to inform Parliament as to government policy and to make announcements to the chamber so parliamentarians are aware of what is coming. They should not be used as what we've just heard, a 15-minute party political broadcast on behalf of the Scottish National Party in the most hysterical and ridiculous of terms. Presiding Officer,
Order, please.
I'm aware we have a general election on its way, but can you and members of the Bureau reflect upon what we've just heard and make sure in future parliamentary time is not being abused in this fashion?
Can I thank Mr Fraser for the point of order? Mr Fraser is right. The Bureau did agree and set aside 45 minutes for the statement, including 50 minutes for the Minister. All parties, including the Conservative Party, Labour, Liberals and Greens, will have the chance to ask questions, including an extended period for their opening speaker. However, I would take this opportunity, given that a general election is imminent, to remind members not to bring election politics too much into this. It's going to happen. I recognise it's going to happen, but I would ask members, please, to keep the election campaigning outside the chamber and keep the chamber for government business and the questioning of that government business. Mr Tompkins, question from... We'll start with questions. Mr Tompkins first.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And it is customary on these occasions to thank the Minister for early sight of his statement. Presiding Officer, I was fully expecting the Minister to come to Parliament today to apologise. He said... Yes, he said that the Prime Minister had no intention of negotiating a Brexit deal and was intending to take the UK out of the EU without a deal. He was wrong. But today, there was no apology from the SNP. His boss, Nicola Sturgeon, who's just left to go campaigning, presumably, said that there are no meaningful negotiations going on. She was wrong. But today, the Minister offers no apology for the misleading and mistaken statements of his boss. SNP leader in the House of Commons, Ian Blackford, about to lose his seat, said it is a complete sham to say that negotiations are taking place. He was wrong. Yeah. But today the Minister glosses over all of this to treat us not to a ministerial statement worthy of the name, but to a party political broadcast on behalf of the Scottish National Party. The truth is this, Presiding Officer. Mike Russell called for a transition period. Boris Johnson's New Deal provides for one. Mike Russell called for no hard border on the island of Ireland. Boris Johnson's New Deal ensures that we won't have one. Nicola Sturgeon called for a guarantee on EU citizens' rights. Boris Johnson's New Deal provides it. Is it not the case, Presiding Officer, that the SNP rail against this deal because they want the most chaotic Brexit possible? Is it not the case, indeed, that they want a no-deal Brexit? Because the only thing they care about is independence. And they think, do they not, that the shortest route to independence is via a no-deal Brexit? Isn't that the real reason, Presiding Officer, why Mr Russell has come to Parliament today, armed not with apologies, but with yet another stockpile of manufactured grievance?
Michael Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank Mr Tompkins for his very non-political question? I called for many things which I want to see Scotland have, and I called, have many times, for Scotland to be in the single market and the customs union. That is absolutely essential. Indeed, that was the basis of the paper that we published at the end of 2016. That has been treated with contempt by the Conservatives, both north and south of the border. I called for and still call for Scotland's right to choose what it should decide to do. And that is a basic democratic right. That is opposed by the Conservatives north and south of the border. I have constantly opposed a no deal because it would be tremendously damaging. It has not only been pursued by the current Prime Minister, but the opportunity for a no deal is still on the table. And indeed, given the terms of the withdrawal agreement, and people may not realise this, that the decision about what happens next would be taken not this time next year, but in July next year, according to the withdrawal agreement. So we will have, Brexit will not get done no matter what happens within 5 months of leaving the EU. If we leave on the 31st of January next year, we'll be back to where we are now. That is primarily why I wish to see an end to Brexit. And of course, Mr Tompkins wished to see no Brexit originally. It's a pity he has walked away from that for purely party advantage.
Alec Rowley, followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I would thank the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of his statement. I think we can absolutely agree that a no-deal Brexit will be very damaging for Scotland, that Mrs May's deal was bad for Scotland, and that Johnson's deal is even worse and will damage Scotland. Of that, there can be no doubt. Therefore, when it comes to Brexit, I hope that we can unite in this chamber, apart from the Tory party, to get that message out there in the campaign in the coming weeks that Brexit is bad for Scotland. But the forthcoming campaign is about more than just Brexit. It's about the kind of economy, the kind of society, the kind of future that we want for our country. Does he agree that his own party's Growth Commission proposals are as bad for Scotland and will give us years, indeed decades of austerity? And the only party that will stop austerity and transform our economy for the many is the Labour Party. So the only choice on the 12th of December is a Labour government or a Tory government, a hard Brexit or a people's choice, a people's vote. Does he agree?
Well, I have the greatest admiration for Mr Rowley, but strangely I do not agree with that point. And I don't agree for a very clear set of reasons. I do agree that certainly we should unite against Brexit. People of Scotland voted against Brexit. Brexit should not take place. We should try and do everything we can to make sure it doesn't take place. But we should also consider two other things. What circumstances could it happen again? Could this constitutional chaos happen again? The circumstances in which Scotland votes one way and the rest of the United Kingdom votes another way, and we are left powerless. How do we avoid that happening ever again? There is only one answer to that, and the answer is independence. And the second thing is the positive nature. I know Mr Rowley and I both want to see a better Scotland for all its citizens. But to be fair, the Labour Party has tried to do that over the last 100 years, and look where we are. The solution to a better Scotland, a Scotland that works for all its citizens, is the normal solution of independence. And what's more, we see it working all across Europe, because 11 members of the EU are the same size or smaller than Scotland. We are as prosperous as anybody else. We are, in actual fact, the best educated country in Europe, officially. We have huge assets. We have the opportunity to do exceptionally well. The naysayers may shout from the Labour backbenches. They're always going to do that. But the reality is Scotland, and also the hollow laughter is from those that do not understand that Scotland has every bit as great a potential as any other country. Let's be real about it. Let's realise that potential. Let's choose independence. And I look forward to working with Mr Rowley in an independent Scotland to build the best possible place for all our citizens.
Patrick Harvey, to be followed by Willie Rennie. Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary mentions the level playing field provisions in the withdrawal agreement, or rather those that have been removed from the withdrawal agreement and put into the weaker, non-binding political declaration. And we know why this has been done. A hard-right libertarian agenda by some in the UK government. Indeed, just this month, Liz Truss the Trade Secretary, said that scrapping those protections is vital for giving us the freedom and flexibility to strike new trade deals. And on the same day, an unnamed Cabinet source told The Sun, the level playing field promise has to go. It would seriously restrict our ability to deregulate. If that withdrawal agreement bill is put forward after the election, is there anything in the current devolution settlement that would allow the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government to protect Scotland, even in devolved areas, from that kind of deregulation agenda, especially in light of the effective abolition of the legislative consent principle, as we've seen by the UK Government? And can the Cabinet Secretary tell us, has he withdrawn his legislative consent memorandum, given that the bill has fallen for the time being, or is he still asking this Parliament to scrutinise and formally consider that memorandum, given that we know that bill may come back in some form or other after an election?
Michael Russell.
On the legislative consent memorandum, I'll bear in mind what the member says. I think the likelihood is that we will allow it to be considered, but I'd want a little bit of time to think about that in the light of the parliamentary business that's building up. There are, of course, proposals that I have brought to the table in the Joint Ministerial Committee to reform the legislative consent process, which have been utterly ignored by the UK Government. And therefore, it is impossible to see us giving legislative consent to this bill or any other bill to do with Brexit unless those are reformed. But let me come to the issue of level playing field, because it is absolutely central to the issues we've got here. And the short answer to Mr Harvey is there is nothing in the present devolution settlement that in the end cannot be overruled. And that is why independence is the only way to defend Scotland against Brexit, to get done with Brexit, by making sure that we can move on once and for all from it. The level playing field provisions were agreed to by Theresa May as a means of moving forward. They are an absolute anathema to most current Tories in the House of Commons, and particularly to the Prime Minister and the hard right around him. And it is quite clear that this will be the major issue to be discussed and debated in the transition period. And there is no way that the EU will weaken its position on it. Mr Barnier says no tariffs, no quotas, no dumping. It is absolutely central to the relationship that will exist, and because the Prime Minister and those around him hate those regulations, they hate workers' protections, they hate human rights, they hate environmental protections. In all those circumstances, what will happen is those will be chipped away at, they will be eroded bit by bit, and ordinary people will suffer greatly. Now, most of the parties in this Parliament, not all probably, but most of the parties in this Parliament want to protect people's basic human rights. They want to protect employment rights. They want to protect environmental rights. And in those circumstances, only by getting rid of Brexit, and actually only by choosing independence, will we be able to do so.
Willie Rennie.
The Minister is rightly incredulous that the Conservatives can defend a deal that puts a border in the Irish Sea when they condemned that deal last year. I'm not sure how they can call themselves unionists anymore. But I am puzzled that the Minister states that breaking from the EU will be a disaster, but breaking from the UK will be of benefit. Does he not get it by now that putting up borders and barriers costs jobs and the economy? Does he not understand that we need to learn the lessons of Brexit, not repeat them with independence? Instead, we should just stop Brexit.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I agree with the member that we should stop Brexit, but the reality is that he has no plan to stop Brexit. His only plan to stop Brexit was to have a second referendum, and we would still support that second referendum, whether a prospect of it succeeding. But the member has consistently failed to address the central question in this, because he cannot guarantee in any sense that there will be a defeat for the forces of Brexit now or in the future. Then he has to recognise that there is one surefire way of getting Brexit finished and moving on as a normal nation, and that is independence. That fact will not go away. It is staring Mr Rennie in the face, and one day he will have to recognise it.
Thank you. Now, all the parties have had a chance to make an opening statement alongside their questions. So can I just encourage all the subsequent questioners to ask a question about the statement and about the withdrawal agreement, rather than particularly, I don't want to hear any pleas to vote for one party or another on December the 12th. So if that's in your question, please remove it now before I call you. I call Keith Brown to be followed by Jamie Green. Keith Brown.
President Officer, I'll make no mention of the 12th of December when there's a general election which the SNP hope to win. I would just simply say that in light of the failure of the UK Government to stand by its cast-iron guarantees to refuse to send a letter to the EU, to Brexit by the 31st of October, that's tomorrow, or not to put a border in the Irish Sea, does the Cabinet Secretary believe that the commitment by Michael Gove to this Parliament that the transition period under this deal will end by the end of 2020 and that the UK will have negotiated and ratified a comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU by that time is just as vacuous and disingenuous as any other Tory promise?
Well, I do agree, and of course if you look at the track record and history of the person that's saying it, they've not been right about much over a long period of time. But then you actually have to look more widely and look at what the UK ministers have themselves said and did say about the process of negotiation with the EU over the withdrawal agreement. This was meant to be the easiest agreement on record. This was meant to, all the cards, I think David Davis said, all the cards were in the UK's hands, and this would essentially be over by Christmas. Yeah. It's not even over by this Christmas, let alone the Christmas he was meaning. The reality of this situation is nobody who has any involvement or interest in or knowledge of free trade negotiations, particularly with the EU, who have the best negotiators in the world, believes this will be concluded by the end of 2020. What is more likely, and of course some ERG members have given the game away on this, what is more likely is that the side assurances that come from people like Michael Gove that in actual fact there's no intention of coming to a deal because they want no deal at the end of this period, those are the things that count for them. And people should remember that. Getting Brexit done in those terms means getting what the Tory right wing wants. And it doesn't want to be tied down by the things that the EU insist upon in the level playing field. That is the reality.
Jamie Green to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This agreement provides the gateway to the UK's exit from the Common Fisheries Policy and the UK becoming an independent coastal state. Those are the words of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, which begs the question, Presiding Officer, if the agreement is good enough for our fishermen, why isn't it good enough for Mike Russell and the SNP?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, it's not good enough for many of the fishermen I represent, I have to say, and there are very considerable fears that are now arising. Let me give Jamie Green one of them. He is an MSP that represents, I think, the west of Scotland. He might consider this because it will affect people that he knows. The agreement would permit boats, particularly inshore boats that fish in the Clyde and on the other side of the Mull of Kintyre, to register in Northern Ireland and to sell their produce in Northern Ireland. That would allow them to sell it without tariffs and without difficulties. So it could spell the end of the processing sector in whole parts of the west coast of Scotland. That's the reality of it. Moreover, I don't think anybody who has been involved in any way in looking at fishing over the last 10, 15, 20, 30 or 40 years would believe a word the UK government said to the Fishermen's Federation or anybody else. Because what will happen is their rights will be traded away as they always have been. So Jamie Green needs to consider the reality of what has happened and the reality of what can happen out of this agreement and perhaps be a little bit more sceptical about what he is told by the UK government.
Annabel Ewing to be followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary, the Tories in this chamber used to hold to the principle that they wouldn't support a deal that created a border of any kind in the Irish Sea, nor one that led to Northern Ireland having a different relationship with the EU than the rest of the UK. Can the Cabinet Secretary clarify, given that Boris Johnson's deal does both, whether he has had any indication that the Scottish Tories now oppose this deal, or is it simply a case of the Tories in Scotland saying, those are my principles, if you don't like them, I have others?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think that sums it up pretty well. I mean, I've quoted from Ruth Davidson and David Mundell. I've quoted from Adam Tompkins. I repeat Adam Tompkins' words. There can be no separate Brexit deal for each of the nations that comprise the United Kingdom. No unionist could ever endorse any sort of differentiated deal. This is a differentiated deal. There are no ifs and buts about it. That's what it is. And it has been endorsed by the Scottish Conservatives because they are Conservative first. And I have to say anything else a long way behind.
Claire Baker to be followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, this is an awful deal, and right now the best way to get rid of it and to stop a no deal is to get rid of Boris Johnson, and with a general election on the horizon, people now have that opportunity. Recognising the paper that's published today, the Cabinet Secretary, will he join me in calling for the UK Government to publish their economic analysis and forecasts for this damaging deal, so that the electorate can be properly informed about the impact of this deal it will have on our country as they go to the polls?
I wonder, before the Cabinet Secretary replies, I wonder if Ms Speaker heard me. I was trying to suggest to members that they don't ask questions which urge people to vote one way or another for or against any other party. A brief response, Mr.
I would agree with the member, certainly with regard to the UK Government publishing information. I did, however, ask Michael Gove 10 days ago if there had been any work done on the comparative disadvantage between Scotland and Northern Ireland, given the deal, and he said there hadn't. So I suppose it's pretty impossible for them to publish work they haven't done, but they should have done work on the impact of this deal, and that work should be published.
Ruth Maguire, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary will note the 2018 UK Migration Advisory Committee's conclusion that EEA migrants are net contributors to our health service and in the provision of social care through both financial resources and work. My Ayrshire constituents requiring vital support both in hospital and at home value and depend upon the care they receive from our workers from EU countries. Yet the Tories can't stop boasting about how this deal will end freedom of movement. Can the Cabinet Secretary set out exactly what this deal means for EU migration? And does he agree with me that the implications of this Tory deal are absolutely nothing to boast about?
Yes, of all the things that the Tories presently boast about, I have to say this boast that they have ended freedom of movement is amongst the most horrible and amongst the most self-defeating. Because freedom of movement is immensely beneficial to Scotland, and particularly rural Scotland. If I look at my own constituency, I know that freedom of movement is actually vital as a means of trying to stem the rise of depopulation and the difficulties that we have. And this deal will continue to drive EU citizens out of Scotland and will be a disincentive for EU citizens to come to Scotland. I was speaking at the NFU Autumn Conference last Friday, and there were farmers there, and particularly on the East Coast, those involved with fruit farming, who have seen part of their crop rot on the bushes this year. We know in England part of the apple crop has rotted on the trees this year because of shortage of labour. This will only get worse. Supporting the end of freedom of movement is bad for incoming labour, and it is really bad for people who want to go elsewhere. I recorded a brief message this morning for a Scottish lady who is a teaching assistant in the south of France. And I did it on the basis supporting what she's doing, so her class could also understand that Scotland is keen to continue that type of exchange, not make it more difficult.
Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, less than 10 days ago, Michael Gove confirmed to this Parliament's Finance Committee that this deal that's on the table would actually provide easier access for Northern Ireland to the European single market as compared to elsewhere within the UK, including Scotland. So with that in mind, what are the implications for Scottish business being at a competitive disadvantage? And does the Cabinet Secretary believe that the Tories have actually now thrown Scottish businesses under Boris's Brexit bus?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the number of bodies under the Brexit bus is quite considerable because Northern Ireland has been thrown under a Brexit bus. Scottish businesses, there soon won't be room underneath it. They'll have to get another bus with another vacuous and inaccurate slogan upon it. But the reality of this deal, as I've tried to indicate in the statement, is that Scottish businesses will be put at a disadvantage. And it is obviously so, because Northern Ireland will have direct access to the single market and will be in 2 customs zones. There will be considerable difficulties in implementing that, and difficulties in Scottish ports in implementing that. But there is no doubt that this will work against the interests of Scotland. If people were going to set up a business that worked and needed to work with the EU or within the EU, they would do so in Northern Ireland, not in Scotland. That is where we are now. Now, the other disadvantage is the democratic disadvantage. It is absolutely wrong that Northern Ireland should have the opportunity to say yes or no to this deal on a regular basis. Quite interestingly, of course, apparently having an independence referendum after 6 or 7 years is wrong, but you can actually look at this again in Northern Ireland every 4 years. That seems a rather curious contradiction. But the reality is the deal favours Northern Ireland. I'm not against Northern Ireland being given all the special treatment it wants. But I do think that Scotland should not be left at a disadvantage as a result of that.
Graham Simpson, to be followed by Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you. On 17th of October, Dame Caroline Fairbairn, the Director General of the CBI, said, "This deal unlocks a transition period, guarantees rights of the 4 million citizens living abroad in the UK and EU, and opens a pathway to a new EU-UK partnership. It would keep trade flowing freely across the island of Ireland and, most importantly, avoid a damaging no-deal scenario. Presiding Officer, why does the Cabinet Secretary think he knows more what's best for business than the leader of British business?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as the member knows, I know the member has been a keen Brexiteer, so maybe his eyes just glossed over the start of that statement. But in actual fact, her first premise was no Brexit at all. Her first premise was that she did not want Brexit to take place, and that's exactly my first premise here too, because Brexit will be damaging no matter what. When you get to the stage that your businesses are suffering greatly, of course you will grasp any straw you can. But this is a straw, and it's a very weak straw. And it's in fact a straw that will not raise you up in the water in the slightest, because it's going to cause enormous difficulties, and even worse difficulties for Scotland. And if Mr Simpson would like to go online, and I invite him to go online and look at the map of Scotland that we have put up with the 7,000 data zones that show how Brexit will impact it, he will find in every part of Scotland damage will be done. And in some parts of Scotland there will be enormous damage done. Now, at least he has had the courage of his convictions from the beginning. He wanted to pursue this no matter the evidence, and I think would pursue this no matter the evidence. If he was the last man standing in a Brexit Scotland, he would be happy. But there are people on the Tory benches who were opposed to this, who knew how bad it was, and they are the ones who are really culpable, because they're allowing this to happen, and they're allowing that damage to take place, and they're not lifting a finger to speak up for those they represent.
Jenny Gilruth, to be followed by Neil Findlay. Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Boris Johnson's commitment to protect workers' rights has been shown to be nothing but smoke and mirrors. Does the Cabinet Secretary see this deal, as I do, as facilitating a race to the bottom when it comes to standards and rights derived from EU membership, particularly environmental protection and the rights of working people?
The level playing field, as I keep stressing, is absolutely central to this. And if you look at what has happened to the level playing field commitment, it has moved from the legally binding withdrawal agreement into the non-binding protocol, which should make anybody suspicious. Then you're in the position in the non-binding protocol where, behind the scenes, senior Tory figures are saying, don't worry, lads, we'll get rid of this. We don't really want this at all. And if in those circumstances, anybody who believes that this deal guarantees workers' rights, guarantees human rights, or guarantees environmental rights is, I am afraid, very easily taken in, or they haven't read it.
Neil Findlay, to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Out there in the real world, just yards from this place, we see people sleeping in the cold streets of this city, people dying from drugs in record numbers, and waiting times for health services growing. I wish we were hearing from the government on these important issues rather than this pathetic knockabout today. But does the Cabinet Secretary accept that Brexit is nothing compared to the complexity and upheaval of unravelling 300 years of social, economic and political integration with our friends and neighbours across the UK? And what would be better? What would be a better option for Scotland is further devolved power and no barriers within the UK market.
Cabinet Secretary.
I know it's difficult for Mr Findlay to be self-reflective or self-critical, but let me ask him to do so. Let me ask him just to do so for a moment and to think about this point: that the actions of the Labour Party have enabled a Tory government to run Scotland for generations. And if we were to take actions that prevented that happening, then we would not have had austerity, we would not have had the cruel social policies we have had, we would not have had the bearing down upon the Scottish and local authority budgets that have taken place. So it is a choice for Mr Findlay to make, because no matter what he says, the longer he perpetuates the ability of the Tories to run down Scotland, the more he himself will be culpable for the problems he talks about.
Willie Coffey, to be followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish exports of technology, digital and media services represent nearly 10% of our total exports to the European Union, resulting in over £1.4 billion worth of trade. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that under this deal, Scotland and the UK will be operating outside of the digital single market? And what clarity has the UK Government provided as to what this means, for example, for e-commerce, country of origin principles and on geo-blocking?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member raises a very important point. The digital single market offers a huge opportunity to companies large and small within Scotland. The transition period will see us continuing in that, but at the end of the transition period, unless it is specifically negotiated, and it's a complex thing to negotiate because it involves issues of data security amongst others, we would not be part of that. Now, that would be bad enough, but there are issues in Brexit which are opportunities foregone. Things that we would be involved in, which would continue to grow and develop, which we then stand back from because we're shut out from. And the digital single market is a really strong example. Not only will it disadvantage us not to be in it, it will greatly disadvantage our growing tech sector, our exciting tech sector, if we can't continue to progress with the digital single market. And it is those opportunities foregone, which are very difficult to quantify, but are there in great number, that we should also concentrate on.
And Emma Harper.
Channel 4 dispatches this week uncovered secret talks between the UK and the US, the governments and the pharmaceutical industry regarding the US having access to the NHS post-Brexit in the form of trade deals. I find this deeply concerning. Will the Cabinet Secretary join me in condemning the US involvement in our NHS? And will he encourage the UK Government to fully disclose all talks between the governments with regards to trade deals, particularly when it comes to our NHS?
Indeed, it's, the member makes a really important point. Not only were the revelations in the Dispatches programme deeply troubling, but of course the revelations also illustrated the fact that Scotland had not been consulted in the slightest. My good friend here, the Health Secretary, had not had a phone call from Matt Hancock or anybody else to say, what do you think of this? How should we have these conversations? In fact, we were deliberately cut out from it. And as with health, so it will be with agriculture, so it will be with fisheries, so it will be with all sectors of the Scottish economy. There will be every attempt to keep us away from any discussions of trade. Now, we published a paper last year on trade. I know my friend, the Trade Minister, stands very firmly behind that paper. There are ways in which this could take place if we were involved and consulted. But without that, this will be an attempt, as I said in my statement, this will be an attempt to give extra money to American billionaires at the expense of ordinary people in Scotland.
Thank you very much, Minister. Members, that concludes our statement this afternoon, and we'll move on to the next item of business.